I'm going to begin, if I may, in the third chapter of Magnifica, which is the, as you'll know if you've read it, the discerning theological heart of the encyclical. So you've got these wonderful first two chapters with this wonderful survey of Catholic social teaching and the principles, and then this chapter, which is really the engine of the encyclical, and from it flows beautifully 4 and 5. In this part, towards the end of chapter 3, Leo has a very, very important discussion, which has already been alluded to by Anna, about grace and self-transcendence. So he's responding at this point to the challenge of what's known as transhumanism and posthumanism. So this is not, and I really want to repeat what Anna said, this is not about the tech. It's about our relationship with the power of the tech. And one of the ways in which that power can be misused is to fuel, if you like, the fantasies of overcoming limitations and suffering through enhancements that allow us to rise above others and escape our frailties. So Leo contrasts this with the Christian tradition of self-transcendence. And we have to be a bit careful with that word, self-transcendence, because, of course, it's the opening of ourselves to the gift of grace and God. And he's essentially saying that where we embrace those limitations and we open ourselves to God's Spirit, that is the place where we become, as it were, more than human. It's where we experience true growth in love. And Leo says, and he says it really well at the end of the encyclical, both of these yearnings are part of the same thing, a yearning to be more than human. And this doesn't come in with technology. It's as old as humanity itself. I begin here because I want to focus on 127. And he says this, paragraph. For centuries, the Christian tradition has maintained that human beings are not confined by the boundaries of their own nature. Rather, they are called to self-transcendence, not through an escape from reality or a contempt for their limitations, but through their fulfillment in love. And then he goes on to speak about this opening to grace as the work and our transformation, as the work of the Holy Spirit. And he quotes Francis in Evangelii Gaudium, great phrase, we become fully human when we become more than human, when we let God bring us beyond ourselves in order to attain the fullest truth of our being. And he adds this, herein lies the radical departure from Promethean dreams. What saves humanity is not enhanced self-sufficiency, but a relationship that liberates, a communion that transforms. Why do I begin here? Because I do want to talk, I know I'm supposed to give a general survey of the themes, but I really want to focus on this, to me, what the encyclical is really about, which is power and our relationship to it. And that's why I was struck by this word Promethean that Leo used. Now, Prometheus, I'm sure you know, figure from Greek mythology, he's the Titan, he's not a god, he's a kind of intermediary between humanity and the gods. And he steals fire from the gods, and he gives it to humanity. Fire, which of course enables civilization. So Prometheus brings a liberating gift. It's an act, one might say, of emancipation. But it's also, and particularly in the eyes of those Greek gods, a transgressive act, one that breaches the boundary between the human and the divine. And for this crime, you may know, Prometheus is severely punished, bound to a rock forever, having his liver eaten by birds, the symbol of hubris. So the myth's title, the myth is recounted in the account by Cecilius, called Prometheus Bound. But there's an ambiguity in this word Promethean, which we can already see from that story. Power can liberate, power can oppress. A bit like fire, it brings us together to keep us warm, but it can also burn us, and we can use it to burn others. Yeah? So that's true of all technological development. It's especially true of AI, probably the most remarkable technological development ever, some say, certainly in our lifetimes. Amplifies our capacities extraordinarily, but is also the source of dread because it creates an intelligence that grows by itself, created by us and yet risking to be autonomous from us. Now, that's not how the Pope is using Promethean in this case, but a lot of the debates around AI use this. Now, for a bit of fun, I thought I'd just go into this, the development of this idea of Promethean. And there was a play published in 1820 by Percy Shelley called Prometheus Unbound. Shelley's a romantic writing in the aftermath of the French Revolution, emphasizes one side of Prometheus, the symbol of noble human liberation and aspiration, one who defies tyranny and empowers ordinary humanity. In Shelley's romantic telling, the nasty Zeus, or Jupiter, stands for all oppressive authority, and this is after the French Revolution. He's a romantic, so he includes in this churches and priests and kings and institutions, all tyrannical authority. And Prometheus represents, if you like, the human mind refusing to be subjugated and acts to liberate others. Actually, in his telling, quite a Christ-like figure, not that he would say that. Now, here's the fun thing. Percy Shelley was married, not very long, because he died in 2022, to Mary Shelley, the Gothic novelist, who in 1818 publishes Frankenstein, which is subtitled, you may not know this, The Modern Prometheus. Now, Victor Frankenstein is not the name of the monster, it's actually the name of the scientist who creates the monster, who's a sapient creature made up of body parts that are electrified. We don't go into it. You've seen the film, read the story. The monster awakens. Frankenstein, horrified by what he's created, then flees. And the rest of it is a Gothic tragedy. The violent monster with human longings, rejected by humanity, and so on. But isn't that fun? Here we have a married couple, both of them writing about Prometheus. And here we have the other side of Prometheus, irresponsible transgression, the gift that becomes a curse. The creator, driven by ambition, recklessly bringing into the world this thing that can't be controlled, that ends up consuming us and surpassing its creator. So the Shelleys, if you like, represent these two different ways of relating to the Promethean act. One asks, what happens when humanity claims its creative power? The other asks, what happens when we fail to take moral responsibility for what we've created? Now, in relation to AI, there's obviously a difference between AI and the Frankenstein monster, because we know AI is not human, even though it might try to look like it. But as we've said, Magnifica is not about the AI, fundamentally. It's not for or against the technology. Leo makes clear that it's about how we relate to it, what we do with it. In other words, it's about us. And here's where I think the Shelleys can help us to elucidate what the encyclical is asking us to see and choose. Now, after that paragraph where he's talking about Promethean dreams, he concludes chapter 3, developing this point, that humanism, Christian humanism, is not opposed, has never been opposed to technology, and celebrates the creative intelligence of humanity as a gift that can alleviate suffering and open up new possibilities. As it were, Percy's Prometheus. But he makes clear that it must be anchored in the common good, it must care for the poor and creation, it must be accountable, it must be transparent, the way of Nehemiah, the city of God, and so on, where power is exercised for and on behalf of the community. If not, we have Mary Shelley's nightmare. If power grows, this is Leo, if power grows while the heart withers and human bonds fray, then we are faced with a new form of Babel, a construction that is grandiose but fundamentally dehumanizing. So this is the choice that Magnifica sets out, and it runs throughout the encyclical, and it's so clear and it's so simple that it almost needs nobody to help to elucidate that. That sets us before us these two paths, these two ways of living and dealing with the Promethean fire. But what I think I can contribute is a little bit of the background to this in terms of the discussion of power. Leo is neither optimistic nor pessimistic about AI because neither of those stances involves our agency or indeed God. If we are optimistic about AI, in other words, if we say, there'll be a few problems, but on the whole, it'll all be fine. It'll make us all better. We can just bow out. It doesn't involve us at all. Or indeed, if we're pessimistic, it's going to lead us into World War III, the extinction of humankind. Again, we can sit back and do nothing. Our own agency is immaterial. But if, as the Incarnation has revealed, we are co-creators with God, given freedom and agency and responsibility, then we have to choose another path. Not optimism, not pessimism, but discernment. AI is an amazing tool with the power to heal, connect, educate, protect. That's in paragraph 9 of the encyclical. But at the same time, it has the power to divide, exclude, generate new forms of tyranny and injustice. So we have no choice, if we take the Incarnation seriously, but to engage with this thing, to hold it to account, to engage with it, see, judge, act on the basis of where we see, God's reign breaking out in this new technology or in what this new technology has brought us. And where also, to use Ignatian language, we see the bad spirit at work. So we must respond. That's why we have this encyclical to guide us in that discernment. But here's where Magnifica, I think, and Magnifica therefore stands in a very long tradition set forth beautifully of the popes doing exactly that. But here's where I think Magnifica differs quite substantially from most of this tradition. And I think there's a break in CST. Other people in the room know CST better than I and may contradict me. But I think Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti, and Magnifica have begun a new era in Catholic social teaching. I think it's fair to say that from Rerum Novarum through to Caritas in Veritate, the popes are essentially addressing a European, yes, to some extent the world, but a European industrial age in its various developments. But from Evangelii Gaudium, Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti, and now Magnifica, the popes are addressing a post-industrial, globalized, digital world. Leo calls it the fourth industrial revolution, but it's post-industrial. And what they're doing concretely is applying a discernment which first emerged in the great meeting of the Latin American bishops in May 2007 in Aparecida, Brazil, where they first used this phrase, a change of era. And the phrase was often used by Francis, and I think it's a key. Leo has used it, I think, something like 14 or 15 times since his election. He used it just now in Spain. And it's in Magnifica, in paragraph 6, and right at the end in paragraph 229. Why does this expression matter? Because he's not talking about an era of change. And it's really clear to be this distinction. Leo, by the way, is very clear about this distinction because in January he said, we are living at a time of profound readjustment of cultural paradigms. We are now, as in Pope Francis's well-known expression, not in an era of change, but in a change of era. Cambio de época, cambiamento di época in Italian and Spanish. In English, inconsistently badly translated by the Vatican, even in this encyclical, which in the second instance translates it as epochal change, and in the first instance, change of era. So just to warn you, if you're looking for the phrase, it's often mistranslated. Why does it matter to make this distinction? Because humanity under the past decades has been undergoing a deep shift in which technological and other developments have been so rapid and so far-reaching that they have, as it were, shattered the capacity of our culture to integrate them. There's a shattering of an order, and it's taking time for that new order to emerge. And in the meantime, the popes say this, they pointed out, this is a time of anguish and of powerlessness. Francis, I think, describes it best in Evangelii Gaudium 52, when he talks about despair and violence rising in the world despite increased prosperity. Paragraph 9, Leo in Magnifica, emphasizes this sense of powerlessness. We are living through a rapid phase of transition, he says, a change of era, in which most people are watching and waiting, observing from afar, and merely hoping for the best. I think that's a key line. He begins by saying, we're in this change of era, and people are saying, what's going on? There's a suffering there to which, if you like, he's responding in anguish. What defines this change of era? Well, I've done a bit of work on this. Francis in Evangelii Gaudium gives the key, using the Aparecida discernment, when he talks of the enormous qualitative, quantitative, rapid and cumulative advances in the sciences and technology, and by their instant application in areas of nature and life. We are in an age of knowledge and information, he says, which has led to new and often anonymous kinds of power. And here's the key that I thought it would be helpful for me to share with you. That phrase, anonymous power, comes from Romano Guardini's key 1950 text, quoted often in Laudato Si, The End of the Modern World. It's again quoted in Magnifica, so there's a key here, there's a connection. And it's quoted for the same reason. In both cases, Guardini's concept of the technocratic paradigm, where power, as it were, emerges for power's sake, because we can. Laudato Si 109, technology tends to absorb everything in its ironclad logic, and those who are surrounded with technology, and here Francis quotes Guardini, know full well that it moves forward in the final analysis, it being the technology, neither for profit nor for the well-being of the human race, and that in the most radical sense of the term, power is its motive, a lordship over all. So what Guardini means by anonymous power is not just power, it's power that detaches itself from accountability, that attaches itself from personhood. As a result, Francis says, and Leo takes up this again in Magnifica, our capacity as a result to make decisions, our freedom, our space for creativity are all diminished. We become less human to the extent that we hand over to this power. In Magnifica 92 and 93, Leo warns about letting the logic of efficiency, control, and profit shape personal and social decisions, because he says this logic begins to determine everything. We're reduced to mere cogs in the system. I don't need to quote anymore. The encyclical is stuffed with references to exactly that. But what he says, and this is what I, particularly where I think Leo takes this forward, is he talks about how the technocratic paradigm fueled by digital power requires, quote, a new spiritual, ethical, and political framework. I found this fascinating. It's a bold claim. It's never stated completely by Francis, although it's implicit. But that faced with the rise of these autonomous forms of power, we need to create a new framework. What we have just isn't going to cut it. Not politically, not culturally, not sociologically, not even spiritually, he's saying. And the church, therefore, must assist with creating that framework. So Guardini's diagnosis of the change of era, defined by the rise of autonomous power, is, I think, the foundation of these three encyclicals, which I see as a new departure in CST. The End of the Modern World comes out in 1950. There's another really interesting essay. You can download it on the web. It's in a PDF called Power and Responsibility. And in many ways, it's a companion essay to the first one. But in many ways, I think it's more important for understanding what the popes are trying to do. At the heart of Guardini's diagnosis is that humanity is living through this unprecedented expansion of human power, but without a growth in the corresponding moral responsibility, and that this was creating a kind of tyranny in which power is concentrated in the hands of the few, and, well, we get Babel. What Guardini saw as new, that was because we haven't developed those frameworks to hold this power to account, to contain it, the power has become detached from those who wield it to the point where it now masters us and it shapes us. Hence, of course, the Anthropocene, hence the ecological crisis that Francis was addressing in Laudato Si, hence the breakdown of our institutions, which he's addressing in FT, and now, of course, the breakdown or the possibility of tyrannical power posed by AI. By anonymous, he means how bureaucratic and other systems become so complex, so large, that very few of us ever really have the full picture of it. You know, when you're inside these complex, ever more complex systems, it's very hard to stand outside and understand it. So power becomes faceless, unaccountable. People end up making decisions according to the logic of the system, power without responsibility. Guardini has a little footnote. This is, by the way, 1950. And he's saying one of the ways in which you can see this is the way we no longer experience the power that we're exerting. And he takes the example of a man clubbing another man in a primitive society. Come here. He says, when you club, that man clubbing has an experience of what he's doing. He's right there in it. And then he contrasts that with a pilot dropping bombs over a city in the Second World War, where he might know what he's doing, but he isn't experiencing it in the way. Now, that he wrote in 1950. Now, just think of what's been going on in Gaza, where we've had autonomous weapon systems and AI determining targets. There was a rather uncomfortable discussion the other day, I don't know whether you caught it, on Bloomberg with the Anthropic chief Dario Amodei, where he was being asked about Anthropic's role in the Iran school bombings at the beginning of this war on Iran. And it was kind of Amodei saying, well, we're just not sure. Well, we think, maybe it was used, but ultimately it's a human who's supposed to be responsible. And you can see the Bloomberg say, what? Is anybody going to take responsibility for these school children? So a profitable way of reading Magnifica, I want to suggest, is that it's Leo's bid in perfect continuity with Francis to create, on behalf of us, of ordinary humanity, a framework of accountability and responsibility that will prevent power exerting ever greater tyranny over us by becoming ever more anonymous, as it were, to rebind Prometheus. I thought you'd like that. to rebind Prometheus, not in the sense that Jupiter, chains him to a rock, but rebinding Prometheus to the community, to God, to relationship, to the common good. In both Laudato Si and Magnifica, there is a urgent apocalyptic tone to all of this that I don't think you find in previous CST. Francis and Leo are saying this power is here now. It's already shaping our lives. It's already operating. It's already devastating. And it's based on the false notion of self-sufficient human transcendence. It has already achieved sovereignty to some extent. Okay? So the warnings in chapter 4 are really descriptions of anonymous power. I've got loads here, but I won't read them out. But small, highly influential groups, business models thriving on human weakness. And then you see it particularly in the 5th chapter when he's talking about war, when he actually talks about a culture of power. This is a culture that has come out of anonymous power, which he wants to contrast with the civilization of love. Arms market as an autonomous driving force behind military decisions. Financial interests fueling wars across the world. To go back to Guardini, what Leo is naming here is the power that comes into being. Here's the theology that comes into being in the fall. It's there in Genesis, right? It's the power that's separated from God's gift of that power. It's power given by God, but it's separated from God. It's power as ambition divorced from wisdom, and therefore it is demonic. Not that the tech is demonic, but the autonomy, the autonomous power which we give to this thing, that's what's demonic. So what's demonic is the lie that power can be divorced from its source and its purpose. Once we treat that power, which is all power we believe as Christians comes from God, God created everything. Once we treat that power as no longer accountable to God or in the service of the community, it becomes abusive, tyrannical, anonymous, self-referential. So Guardini foresaw that the challenge that faced humanity now, and he was writing back in 1950, he foresaw all this with extraordinary prescience. The issue was no longer how can we acquire power to develop ourselves, but rather how are we going to curb the power that has been unleashed. This is the change of era. Against the Promethean hubris, Guardini describes the metanoia that's needed on the part of humanity, a recovery of the original vocation of man, of humankind before the fall, which of course Jesus comes to restore with his vision of the kingdom of God. And at the heart of it is power, because it's about Jesus' response, if you like, to the fall, is power converted to humility. Power converted into humility, which is, of course, an imitation of God's kenosis. So converting power to humility could be described as the task of Magnifica Humanitas. And CST, the principles of that Catholic social tradition, the means by which this could be achieved. I think this is what Leo is setting forth in chapter 3. And I think what he's performing here is a shift of agency to the people. To the people. Potentia. See, in English we have this word power, which covers everything. It's potestas, it's potentia, it's the capacity to act. And he talks about a more political involvement, capable of slowing things down. He talks about clear criteria, effective oversight by communities. He talks about disarming AI, all the things that Anna has already spoken of. And in chapter 4, this turns into really quite concrete and interesting proposals for that agency to become effective, that potentia to become real, faced with all kinds of challenges, unemployment, the de-skilling of labor, and so on. Interestingly, 181 calls for these processes to be guided by the kind of people that Guardini imagines in power and responsibility. Guardini kind of looks ahead and he says, actually what we're going to need is real Christians. Real Christians who start, as the early Christians did, from the incarnation, from the revelation of Christ, and humility. Because 181 calls for intermediary organizations and educational communities that rebuild trust and relationships by citizens who cultivate responsibility, moderation, discernment, and a sense of truth. In other words, it's calling forth a new kind of human being. No, I shouldn't use that language. A new call for humanity to embrace. But, yes, a kind of a converted human being. And this is what, in 229, Leo calls a sober yet demanding program of Christian life with which we can navigate this change of era in the light of the gospel. So it's about embracing or re-embracing or recovering the original agency which God gives humanity in his creation, the power to become children of God, as Leo puts it. Rather than succumbing to the promise of overcoming limitations by transcending humanity, it's the reverse. It is to welcome the incarnation, to welcome this divine wave drawing near, the kenosis, and reflecting that, becoming humble ourselves. So, I've said that this encyclical is really about power, and I'm convinced it is. It's about two kinds of power. One that is unchecked, autonomous, self-sufficient. The other that is self-transcendent, open to God and to others. And I think what Leo is doing here when he warns against Promethean dreams of self-sufficiency is he's seeking to hold to account the Promethean potestas by means of a potentia grounded in relationship. The capacity to become fully human through communion, grace, collaboration, dialogue, accountability, and so on. Or let's put it really simply. Leo is seeking to counter the tyranny of autonomous, or anonymous, I should say, power, with a personal power. The power of a personal incarnate God made known in magnificent humanity. So it's God's design for that power, common good, universal destination of goods, subsidiarity, solidarity, social justice, and the option for the poor, with integral human development as the overriding criterion of the discernment. That, in a sense, is the program, that's the plan that Magnifica sets forth. And what I'm very struck with is how in Magnifica, as in Laudato Si, even though Leo calls on states and governments to act and make laws and regulations that allow for this, I don't think he shares much faith in them. And I don't think Francis does in Laudato Si, and in Laudato Deum, Francis kind of makes clear he doesn't. Because the fact is that we're dealing with the breakdown at the moment of authorities and states and nations and governments. Politics is failing, faced with the rise of this newly anonymous transnational power. And therefore, I think what Pope Francis and Leo are doing in these encyclicals is actually looking to us, looking to ordinary humanity. So he's not excluding everything else, but there's this extra pitch to us to take up our agency in the face of this power, which is, in a sense, depriving us of that agency. One might say this is the papal Promethean act, to bring fire to the people of God, to build the city of God not by rejecting power, because we need power, we need the capacity to act, but by binding it to the community. And that means giving up the illusion of our own powerlessness. Francis told us in Laudato Si that by recycling and turning off our lights, we were building integral ecology. Leo tells us that the civilization of love to counter the culture of power is built from below, in, quote, small and steadfast acts of fidelity that serve as a bulwark against dehumanization. Every act by which our human agency is used to build community and solidarity is a defeat for anonymous power. It's a victor for the fraternity which ultimately holds the world together. But when we surrender that agency, then we allow anonymous power to subject us to a dehumanizing logic, freeing Prometheus to become Frankenstein's monster. So we're at a crossroads. I know we hear that all the time. Politicians love to tell us we have to make a choice, but we do. Because, at least as the popes see it, for the first time in history, the anonymous power unleashed at the fall has the chance finally to rule us, to dominate us, to take charge, to exercise a lordship over all, as Guardini says. And we shouldn't be overwhelmed by this, and popes don't want us to be, because we have at our disposal a power that is greater, because it is the true power, the power rooted in the Creator, that accepts our dependence on that power and on each other. So a power converted into humility that voluntarily accepts limitation, relationality, and finds in these not just freedom from tyranny, but the freedom to flourish as our Creator intended. And in Magnifica, we have a tool for discernment and action that is both an exercise of that dignity and a way of defending it. Leo in Spain had the best quick summary of Magnifica humanitas, and he said to the young people in Madrid, be human. Be truly human, as Christ was human. That way, he said, you change history. And that may be, as I say, the best one line of Magnifica. Thank you very much.